What do we find here? Again, our samples are going to change naturally between measurements. That's just a normal part of change between individuals. So here, many times what ends up having to happen is that we end up now needing to change the way that we actually collect data in terms of that to time two. For instance, in those number three, or threat number three, is the issue related to regression to the mean. Excuse me. So with regression to the mean, this essentially means that our extreme scores now become less extreme and they become more normal. Part of the statistical ideas behind populations is that we always have nice normal distributions, that nice bell-shaped curve that we always assume in terms of data collection. And one of the things that we see is that sometimes we may have extreme views or extreme behaviors by individuals, but as time passes on, those extreme scores, those extreme behaviors and views now start becoming less extreme and they start becoming much more normal, like the majority of what the population views or behaves in those specific instances. And again, that's a natural progression in terms of time. And again, we just have to be prepared for that kind of threat to internal validity. Our fourth issue is the issue related to testing. That one of the issues that we always have to view is that the completion of the dependent variable at time one affects how the dependent variable at time two is going to be completed. Think here of something like a practice effect. And remember, with our practice effects, you already did the completion at time one for that specific measurement. At time two, you're automatically going to get better at it because you've already completed it at one time. So here, the same kind of thing happens with testing. You did it one time, now you know the answers, your behavior will change on time two or be reported differently on time two because of the at time one. Everyone good? Perfect. Sorry, excuse me. I don't know why that all came out at the same time. I apologize. Number five, the issue related to instrumentation. With instrumentation, one of the things that we realize is that since our dependent variable is naturally going to change between time one to time two or across time, our instrument also needs to change. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to change our technique for gathering that data. So take, for example, a child versus an adult. If you're tracking that child across the lifespan and you begin when they're 5 years old, you can't give a child a self-esteem questionnaire. So they're reading items like, when people look at me, I sometimes feel negatively about myself. Children are not going to understand what that means. But you can ask them a question such as, well, when people say things about you behind your back, how do you feel? And they give you a little scale of the little smiley faces. And the child responds with a specific smiley face. That works for the child. Now try giving that to an adult. Now have to change to being able to adapt to that maturation of that sample and also to the situation that's changed across time. Everyone good? Perfect. Number six, the issue related to participant selection. In many instances, whenever it is that we're selecting participants, we find that participants tend to join groups of people that all have a common interest or a common character that make them a part of that group. One of the ways that I always think about this is in the following way. Think about collecting data in research at graduate school. The guy I shared my office with, he used to do video game research. He always had people participate all the time. I mean, this guy would get 5-6 months semester to come and participate in his research studies. On the other hand, with my research studies, they were about language acquisition and bilingualism. Not a lot of people showed up. I would sometimes get 30, 40 people to show up in a semester. And I was fine with that. And one of the problems that he encountered, even though he got 500 or 600 people to come in during one semester, is that he would always say the following thing. Man, to be made up of guys 18 to 20. Yeah, that's who tends to play a lot of video games. Men who are between the ages of 18 and 20. Now, for instance, we start seeing that age being a little bit larger, but in a university quite often. Now, for instance, more women are also starting to participate in those research studies, but 10 years ago, that didn't happen. He would sometimes get 2 or 3 women who would participate in 500. So part of what happens in this specific situation is that people self-select themselves to participate in research studies that are of interest to them. Put a notice out in the hallway and say, we're doing a video gaming research. You're probably going to get males, again, between the ages of 18 and 20, video games. People who are not going to want to sign up for that kind of research study. So these participants themselves create their own cohort and they create their own group. Some of you are already in a cohort, aren't you not? And we technically even label you as being in a cohort. And why? Because you have the same characteristic, you're on the same path, and so on and so forth. Everyone, again, that may create some problems because they already have some unique quality or characteristic that they bring with them. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. So I think one of the things you're saying is pressuring us into actually participating in the situation. And the answer is yes. That's actually a really good technique that we used to drum up business for ourselves, if you want to think of it in that fashion. Um, I'm famously known for doing this kind of stuff, and I haven't done it in a while since my research has kind of dropped off a little bit in the past. But back in the day when I was hiring 4 or 5 research studies a semester, this especially to the larger classes, one of the things that I would do, students would take an exam, for instance, and they would take an exam on Tuesday. On Thursday, my research assistant would show up and say, hey, we're offering this opportunity for a research situation. Would anybody like to participate? And right before they came in, I would say, you know what? People would always say, how are we doing? Exams are there. Exams are there. And I would kind of do that little phase. And of course, well, the exams really were there. I mean, they were there. I were good or bad, it didn't matter to you. I mean, whatever. I mean, they were there. But you would say that to a student, and the students would all freak out. Oh man, we're all failing. And then you have this person walk in the room offering extra credit opportunities. Man, you got 150 people signing up for a research project right away. Is that the most ethically possible thing that's out there? Yes, because the university agrees to do that. Part of what we're going to talk about, university tells you if the IRB, our Institutional Review Board, says that's okay to do, you're good to go. Alone to come up with that, you are going to do some things. So there's a lot of things that I think to myself that I would say, is that really ethical? Yeah, it's fine. We'll be good. And then somebody else looks in and is like, no. I'm like, but it's in the name of research. If it was in the naming and everything out there. But yes, you technically can do that. The issue of providing that undue pressure on them, that's definitely something. Since it's extra credit, it's not a problem because you're giving people that opportunity if they decide or not. It's completely up to them. They have the belief that they may potentially be doing bad, so they need the extra credit. And you never want to give them the grade before they complete the extra credit because then you lose participants because they see their scores and they're like, I don't need to go. So you lose participants. Now, what you never want to do is say, I have your exams. I will not give you back your exam with your grade until you participate. That is having an incentive over their head and putting undue pressure on them. You never want to do that. Now, some universities actually have that kind of system put in place. When I went to grad school at Kansas State University, we would require students to take 3 credit hours of research at Intro to Psychology. If they fail to participate in 3 research studies, technically at the end of the semester they would get an incomplete. They wouldn't get their grade. And then they had 1 semester to actually do the credits, and then we would change their grade from an incomplete to whatever their grade was. That was always borderline to university. That system justified why we would convert their grade to an incomplete, and if they didn't complete if they didn't complete the studies, they would automatically get an F, no matter what their grade was. Yeah, so you could have had an A and you didn't complete the research studies within that next semester, and you would automatically get an F because we claimed that it was for the educational purposes of the opportunity to earn points associated with learning the. Yeah, absolutely. But you're doing that, and that's the way they did it. And actually, are using that same system. Sure. Oh, that's a great question. Now, the institution where I was at when prior to this, not a lot of people did research. I was kind of one of the only ones who was really doing it at that time, me and another professor. So what we would do is we would actually divide up the extra credits. That we would say like, okay, I would have a list of students that participated. I would send it to him, and he would be like, okay, they already participated or not. In his particular classes. If they did my study, I normally tried to keep one study per semester. I had already done it the following semester, and we were still doing the same study. We generally had a record, and we would match them up right away because we had the list of students that had participated. But if there was another research study that they would do, because sometimes, like I say, we had 4 or 5 research studies going on at one time, they could potentially do all the research studies and get extra credit in every single one of them. Yeah, they could. Yeah, it just kind of depends. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, think of it like this. And I know it sounds like a weird thing. And you're like, man, some of that sounds kind of shady and kind of like it's like right there on the borderline. And you're right, it does. But you also have to think about it like this: if we don't collect data and we don't publish, I can't keep my job because I'm a part researcher, right? So you have to find a way to be able to get participants in. And that's a really hard thing to do because it's not always a guarantee that participants are actually going to be coming in to your research situation. So sometimes you can have a research study out there for a whole year and you have 30, 40 participants and you need 500. So you have to find ways to become creative. Excuse me. And this is where sometimes providing different incentives comes into play. And we'll talk again a little bit more about this in ethics. But this is where, sometimes researchers pay their participants. And they can do that, but they have to pay them fairly. So for instance, let's say that you really need participants and I'm doing a research study, but I don't have money to pay my participants. If you offer your participants $10 versus me offering them extra credit, they're probably going to pick yours, right? Because you can use $10 for anything versus extra credit. You can only use it for one thing. But if we all agree that you're doing it for course credit or you're all doing it for extra credit, then you eliminate that need for competition from the participant's point of view. And then there's also a limit in terms of what you can offer. So for instance, for an hour worth of their time, like $10 or $15, I believe, sometimes you can go up to 20 skis. But for instance, paying them $50, well, now you're just getting out there and being crazy about this kind of stuff, to be honest with you. I mean, what kind of money do you have that I don't have? Or for instance, there was a couple of years ago, this happened, that students were getting offered the opportunity to be put in a raffle for a trip to Hawaii. I participate in that study. I'd be like, forget about my research study. I'm going to do yours, man. Hawaii. And then what ended up happening is that they actually did not do the raffle. They just told people that, just so that way they could get participants to come in. Everybody else kind of fell flat and didn't have any participants. They collected a ton of data and then didn't offer the vacation package to anyone, and they got in trouble for that. Absolutely. So whatever promise it is that you're going to keep in terms of the incentive, you have to keep it. That's why the easiest thing to do is do extra credit. It's free. Students want to come in and do it because who doesn't want extra credit? There are a couple of people who don't want it. But you do it at the right time, people to come in. Yes, absolutely. I conduct research. Dr. Gomez conducts research. All of us actually in the psych department. We are all active researchers to a certain degree. We all have different levels of some are much more practice orientated, but there's always a little bit of research that goes into play with that. I'm currently doing some research studies. We're developing them at this point. I just got some of my work published last summer, and I'm working on some other ones to get published this summer that I've been working on for a couple of years. But I'm doing some work since my wife is a dentist. We're doing some work in her offices with trying to promote our patients and how to make sure that we can implement specific intervention techniques that promote hygiene, and how do we track 5-6 years and try to promote that and create different types of intervention techniques. So that's some of the stuff. Other professors are doing stuff on like memory, aggression research, motivation, stuff like that. Oh, yes. Absolutely, absolutely, and you know what? That's not a infrequent statement that I hear. I hear that. I've heard that across every university I've ever been at, and ours is no different. You know, sometimes we're not very good at promoting that we do all this kinds of stuff. If you actually go outside the psych department, there's a big glass display case where you'll see different journal articles that have been published by the various faculty members and books that they write and things of that nature. So, like I say, you know, a lot of us are engaged in a lot of different ways, some more than others. So I would always recommend that if you are interested, go up to your faculty member and say, hey, you know, you're teaching this specific course about, I don't know, group therapy. I'm really interested in doing research associated with group therapy. You know, how do I get involved in doing that kind of stuff, and paving your way in that way. Absolutely, absolutely. And if you guys need a little bit of more direction of like who to talk to, if you send me an email and tell me, you know, who do I talk to about this kind of stuff, I'll find out for you and lead you. Yes, that is true. Sorry about that. But yes, and you know, we try to promote it at the undergraduate level as well, you know, and it's hard because, you know, everyone has lives, you know, in terms of academic lives and then also personal lives. And sometimes, like you guys mentioned, you know, sometimes it's too late about it enough and getting involved in that specific instance. But now that you brought that up to my attention, I'll be sure to bring that up to our program coordinator. Who's okay? Okay. Okay, I'll discuss that with her and let her know that we need to do a little bit more promotion associated with that, especially to the program. Especially that you guys are generally only there for what, about 2 years? Yeah, so I mean 2 years. I mean we'll fly by in a blink of an eye. So we definitely need to do that at a very early stage and start promoting that as soon as possible. But attention, I did not know that. All right. Any other questions, concerns? Okay. I'm almost done. Just a couple of more things to talk about, and then we'll be well on our way to our exam. Issue number 7 is the issue associated with attrition. With attrition, one of the issues that we always encounter is that we find that participants may not return for future measurements. And again, why may that happen? That may happen for a variety of reasons. It may happen because the participants may die, they may move, you lose contact with them, they change their email address, their phone numbers, whatever the case may be. We're always going to have participants not returning for future measurements. I always think of it in terms of percentages. Generally, between 20 to 30% of participants are going to drop off every single time unless you have very good emailing system, or there are people who come into your class on a weekly basis and you're always reminding them. Those kinds of things are going to combat the issue associated with attrition. But if it's just general participants that are coming in that you expect them to remember that they're going to come back for a second session, or that you're going to send them an email or a text message, very rarely, if ever, do all of them come back at that time. Issue number 8, the issue of design contamination. With design contamination, we always want to make sure that we know exactly who is who and what is what within our research studies. Such as, did the comparison group know or find out about the experimental group? And if they did find out about that other group, may they potentially have some type of reactance effect because they're not receiving that same behavior or that same type of compensation? So think of it, for instance, as the control group versus the one who's actually receiving the treatment. The control group doesn't receive any type of treatment at all, no drug, no intervention. In the other group are actually receiving that. Or, hey, my class didn't receive the extra credit opportunity. What's going on? That may now create some type of conflict for us and create differences in terms of the way that the participants may research situation. And again, this may make a reason why the research study may potentially succeed or fail because of unequal compensation or unequal treatments in terms, and making sure that you separate them enough that they may never going to have contact with each other is going to be a very effective way of making sure that we don't have that design contamination occur. Now, issues 9 and 10 are the following: issuatory rivalry, again, making sure that they are receiving very similar treatments or receiving very similar compensations. So we're receiving 5% extra credit, they're receiving extra credit. What's not equivalent? Again, there may be some changes in terms of the behavior, in terms of the way that they respond to the measurements because of the way that they may have been treated. And last, the issue of resentful demoralization. If the subjects learn that their group receives less desirable goods or services, they may experience feelings of resentment in that particular instance. In other words, we know that the other group is receiving the actual drug and we're not receiving the drug. Why are we getting treated differently in that specific case? Behaviors and attitudes tend to change in those specific instances. Questions up to now? Perfect. All right, so now let's move on talking about external validity. Now again, remember, with the idea of external validity is we're trying to generalize our results to the larger population. Now with external validity, we can actually divide it up into two different types, what we call in this particular case. Now with population validity, this means a native is the sample of the actual population of itself. So in other words, we need to make sure that we know who the population of interest is, and we need a sample from that specific population and that they have representation of that population. Now, how do we're actually dealing with that population? Get everyone from the population to participate, eliminate the sample, and remain only with the population. That would be great. But the likelihood of that actually happening is not going to be there. So rather, what are we ending up with? We're going to end up with the sample, a select group of individuals who we assume are a good representation of that population. Now, the laws related to the population, so let's say, for instance, you have a population of 10,000 individuals. You get 50 people. All right, you're approaching representation. You get 500 people. That's a better representation. You get 5,000 out of the 10,000, a better representation of the population because more of that population. Questions so far? Perfect. Brings us to the issue of how widely does the finding actually apply then to the population. So what we want to try to do here is we sometimes want to generalize beyond just the typical population that we sampled from. So in other words, how does this apply to other populations? So it's not just about one single population, but rather now multiple populations in those specific instances. Representative sample from that one single population is going to be very good because if the populations all match up to each other or are very similar to each other, the likelihood of you being able to represent across the different populations is going to also be there in that specific instance. Now, the last issue here that we'll talk about is the issue associated with ecological validity. Now, with ecological validity, that are results across settings, not across populations, but across different situations data in. So let that be, for instance, that we may be collecting our data in the lab versus the field, that we may have, that we may try to eliminate testing, issues related to selection bias and experimental treatments. So here, what do we want to try to do? We want to try to eliminate all these other potential confounding factors that might actually lead us to lacking ecological validity. But here, rather, we want to say we can now translate our results and generalize our results, not just to different populations, like with population validity, but also now across different situations and across different contexts that we can actually collect our data in and also generalize our work in those specific situations. Questions up to now? Perfect. Now, in terms of threats to external validity, just as we saw that there were some threats to internal validity, we do also see that there are threats to external validity. And what are some of those potential threats? One of those threats may be what we're testing, pre-testing, interacting with the experimental treatment and causing some effect that such the results will not generalize to the untested population. So in other words, because of the test itself and the way that we've actually administered that experiment, actually change the way that our results may actually be Now, we also see that the interaction effects of self-selection bias affect the way that we may also generalize our results. So again, here, the people that have selected themselves to participate from the population has become a problem in terms of generalizing. Remember, we put a call out to the population up at the door that says, come in to our video game research study that we're going to be dealing with here in our situation. People from the population come in, but even within they are going to be self-selecting themselves to participate. These are going to be people who, for instance, may not work or may not have families that they're dealing with, and they have more time to play video games. So even though I may have a family and I work, but if you put up a representation of the population of video gamers in that specific instance. So again, it's going to be very important for us to look at. Now, we also see the experimental agreements that some individuals come up upon. So here, for instance, knowing that they're going to get observed for a research study might change their behavior. Now that drastically changes the way that our results all the time. So for instance, the way that you guys are currently behaving and taking things within the research situation might drastically change if, for instance, you had Dr. Healy come in, who's our sit in the classroom. Attentive, you may start jotting down a lot more notes and so on and so forth, because now somebody in an authority position might potentially be there to observe your behavior. Excuse me. Last, the issue of multiple treatments might also have an interference effect associated with our generalizability of our work. Other cases, whenever it is that we have the same individuals receiving 2 or more treatments, measurement designs to account for carryover effects or treatment effects that may not necessarily allow for generalizability of our results. Receiving treatment number 1 and they also receive treatment number 2, even though that may be a couple of days later, that might still have some carryover effect of that specific treatment that they may use out in the real world, that only receiving one of those specific treatments out in the real world may not be as effective. So again, potentially hindering that kind of aspect of generalizability in that instance. So key here, always remember the following. The ideas behind internal versus external validity. Whenever it is that we look at the top, our study design, making it much more believable, leading down to the discussion of internal validity in this particular case. Making sure that we have a very valid design, controlling confounding factors, controlling extraneous, leading us to having very good results. Now the results themselves, once it is that we can generalize those to the population, that's the issue associated with external validity. How will our results apply to the general population in this specific? All right, guys, that wraps up our discussion associated with validity today. Before I end class for tonight, any questions, any concerns? Yes. So what I'll do is I'll record my review session, because again, I'm sorry, I had scheduled it, but I'm gonna have to be traveling at that time. I'm gonna record my review session tonight or tomorrow morning at 2 for you guys, and then I'll have a link for it in Blackboard under the exam folder, so that way you guys can access the review before the exam, and then on Friday, the 30th, I'll be posting up the exam for you guys to be able to complete, and you'll have until the 6th to be able to turn in your exam. All right. Yeah. And remember that for your exam, you guys can print it out, fill in all your responses, scan it, just download the document, type out all your responses, and then submit it again through Blackboard. Absolutely, absolutely. Always there for you guys, whatever it is that you need. Or call me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Even though I'm traveling, I'll still have my phone available and my email too. That is a great question. No. 5. No. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll post that in. All right. Yes. Yes. Correct. The years doesn't matter. The years don't matter. Yeah. And again, I apologize for the video recording for today, guys. I'll post up part 2, but I apologize for part 1. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a nice rest of your week, and I'll do for Thursday. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.